They gathered on Christmas Eve believing they were safe, believing the candlelight and hymns would protect them. But what walked through those church doors in Kentucky that night in 1841 wasn't salvation. It was vengeance wrapped in scripture, and by dawn, the blood had soaked so deep into the wooden floors that they burned the building to ash and swore never to speak of it again. This is the story they erased from every record, every sermon, every history book you were ever given. And if you're hearing this now, understand something. You weren't supposed to. What happened that night wasn't random violence. It was the result of a system so corrupt, so tangled in power and lies, that it required human sacrifice to keep standing. The men who died weren't just victims. They were loose ends. And the man who killed them wasn't a monster. He was a messenger. A living consequence of what happens when you build empires on broken backs and call it God's will. You think the past is dead? You think history is just stories? No. History is a warning. And this one was buried because it named names. It pointed fingers at the shepherds. And the flock was never supposed to know. His name was Solomon Grundy. Not a myth. Not folklore. A real man. Born into slavery on a plantation just outside Lexington, Kentucky, where the soil was red with tobacco profit and human suffering. Solomon wasn't just any enslaved man. He was educated in secret by a plantation owner's daughter who believed, naively, that knowledge could redeem the system. She taught him to read using the Bible. Taught him theology, philosophy, the language of power. And Solomon absorbed it all. Not because he believed in redemption, but because he understood that the same book used to justify his chains could be turned into a weapon. For years, Solomon preached in the slave quarters. Quiet sermons. Whispered salvation. But his gospel wasn't about waiting for heaven. It was about justice on earth. He spoke of Moses, of liberation, of the God who drowned Pharaoh's army. And the overseers grew nervous. By 1840, tensions were boiling. Slave uprisings were spreading across the South. Nat Turner's rebellion was still fresh in every white man's nightmares. And Solomon had become too influential, too calm, too intelligent. So they sold him. Ripped him from the only home he'd known and sent him west to a new plantation, harsher, crueler. They thought distance would break him. They were wrong. The new plantation was owned by a man named Reverend Josiah Polk. Yes, a reverend. A man of God. Who owned 63 human beings and justified it every Sunday from his pulpit in the small river town of Harrow Creek. Polk wasn't just a plantation owner. He was a pillar of the community. A founding member of the local Baptist church. A man who sat on town councils and preached charity while his slaves worked 18-hour days in freezing winters and blistering summers. Solomon arrived in chains. Silent. Observant. The other slaves whispered warnings. Told him Polk was worse than most because he believed he was righteous. That his cruelty was holy. That suffering built character and slavery was God's test. Solomon said nothing. He worked. He listened. And he began to see the structure. Not just of the plantation, but of the entire system. The church wasn't separate from the power. It was the power. It legitimized every whip crack, every sale, every separation of mother from child. The preachers weren't innocent bystanders. They were architects. And Reverend Polk wasn't an exception. He was the blueprint. For 6 months, Solomon kept his head down. But inside he was building something. A plan. A reckoning. And it would begin on the one night the faithful believed they were untouchable. Christmas Eve, 1841. The town of Harrow Creek was covered in snow. The church bells rang at dusk, calling families to the annual midnight service. It was tradition. Sacred. The one night where even the cruelest men pretended to be kind, where hymns rose into the frozen air and everyone played their part in the theater of redemption. Reverend Polk had prepared a special sermon. On forgiveness. On gratitude. On accepting one's place in God's design. The sanctuary was packed. Men in their finest coats. Women in bonnets. Children squirming in pews, eager for the service to end so they could return to gifts and warmth. Outside, the enslaved workers huddled in the cold, forbidden from entering except to serve. Solomon stood among them. Watching. Waiting. He had spent weeks preparing. Not with weapons. Not with violence yet. But with words. He had been meeting in secret with a small group of trusted men. Not to plan escape, but to plan exposure. Solomon had kept records. Written testimonies. Names, dates, crimes. He had documented every sale, every beating, every child torn from their mother's arms under Polk's authority. And tonight, during the holiest service of the year, he planned to walk into that church and read it aloud. To force them to hear the truth in their own sanctuary. But someone had talked. One of the enslaved men, terrified of the consequences, had whispered Solomon's plan to an overseer in exchange for an extra ration of food. The overseer told Polk. And Polk made a decision. He would not allow his reputation, his empire, his standing with God to be destroyed by a slave with a ledger. So he set a trap. The service began as planned. Hymns echoed. Candles flickered. Polk stood at the pulpit, his voice warm and commanding, preaching about the birth of Christ and the humility required to serve a higher purpose. The congregation nodded, lulled into comfort. And outside Solomon made his move. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside. The cold air rushed in with him. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. The Reverend paused mid-sentence, his eyes locking onto Solomon's. For a moment the room was frozen. A black man, an enslaved man, standing in the doorway of a white church on Christmas Eve. It was unthinkable. Blasphemous. Dangerous. Solomon held up the ledger. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. He began to read. Names. Transactions. Children sold. Women violated. Men worked to death. Every word a hammer strike against the myth they had built. Chaos erupted. Men rose from their seats, shouting. Women gasped. Children were pulled close. But Solomon kept reading. Louder. Clear. His voice filled the sanctuary with truth, and for the first time in that building's history, the walls couldn't contain it. Polk's face twisted. Not with shame. With rage. He raised a hand, and from the back of the church, 4 men moved forward. Deacons. Enforcers dressed in Sunday best. They had been positioned there, waiting. This wasn't improvisation. This was premeditated. Solomon saw them coming. He stopped reading. He looked directly at Polk and said the words that would seal his fate. You call yourself a man of God, but you serve only yourself. And God sees you. Then he turned and ran. Not out of cowardice, but strategy. He bolted through the door, back into the snow, leading the men away from the other enslaved workers who had been watching from the shadows. The deacons chased him through the dark, their boots crunching in the snow, their breath steaming in the frozen air. They cornered him near the river, surrounded him, and they beat him. Not to subdue, to destroy. They kicked, punched, used the butts of rifles. And when Solomon finally stopped moving, they dragged his body back to the church. But Solomon Grundy didn't die. Not yet. His body was broken, his face unrecognizable, but his heart still beat. The deacons threw him into the church cellar, a stone-walled storage room beneath the sanctuary where they kept communion wine and old hymnals. They locked the door and returned to the service as if nothing had happened. Polk resumed his sermon. The congregation, shaken but obedient, settled back into their seats. The hymns began again. Above, the celebration of Christ's birth. Below, a man bleeding into the dirt, his body a testament to what happens when you speak truth to power. But Solomon wasn't alone in that cellar. In the hours that followed, as the service stretched into the night, something shifted. Whether it was delirium from blood loss, a spiritual awakening, or the final clarity that comes before death, Solomon began to see. Not with his eyes, but with something deeper. He saw the pattern, the system, the way the church and the plantation and the law and the violence all fed into one another. How they protected each other. How they called it civilization. How they called it holy. And he understood that no ledger, no testimony, no spoken truth would ever be enough. Because the system didn't care about truth. It cared about control. Hours passed. The church service ended. Families returned home, their bellies full of hymns and their consciences clear. The deacons stayed behind to clean up. That's what they called it. Cleaning up. They opened the cellar door expecting to find a corpse. Instead they found Solomon Grundy standing. Barely. His legs shaking. His face swollen beyond recognition. But standing. And in his hand, he held a piece of broken glass from a shattered wine bottle. One of the deacons laughed. A nervous mocking sound. He stepped forward. You should have stayed down, boy. Solomon didn't respond with words. He moved. Faster than a man in his condition should have been able to. He drove the glass into the deacon's throat. Blood sprayed across the stone walls. The man gurgled, stumbled, and collapsed. The other 3 froze. Not in fear. In disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. Slaves didn't fight back. Not like this. Not here. But Solomon wasn't a slave anymore. He was something else. Something the system had created and could no longer control. He picked up the fallen deacon's rifle. And he walked up the cellar stairs. Into the church. Into the sanctuary still lit by dying candles. And he began what history would try to erase. The church wasn't empty. Polk and several town elders had remained behind, gathered in the vestry, discussing what to do with Solomon's body. How to explain it. How to control the narrative. They heard the cellar door creak open. Heard footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Polk stepped into the sanctuary and saw him. Solomon Grundy. Covered in blood. Holding a rifle. Standing in the aisle like an avenging angel torn from the very scriptures Polk had spent years twisting. Polk didn't run. His pride wouldn't allow it. Instead, he opened his arms wide as if offering himself to God's judgment. You cannot kill me, Solomon. I am a servant of the Lord. Solomon raised the rifle. Then go meet him. The shot echoed through the sanctuary. Polk's body crumpled onto the altar steps. The other men scattered. Some ran for the doors. Others hid behind pews. But Solomon moved through the church like a force of nature. Not frantic. Not wild. Methodical. He killed 4 more men that night. All of them elders. All of them plantation owners. All of them architects of the system that had brutalized him and countless others. He didn't kill indiscriminately. He knew their names. Their crimes. This wasn't madness. It was judgment. By the time the sun rose on Christmas morning, 5 men lay dead in that church. The sanctuary was painted in blood and candle wax. The town woke to screams and chaos. Militias formed. Posses rode out. The governor himself was notified. This wasn't just murder. This was insurrection. A direct challenge to the order of things. And it had to be crushed. Solomon disappeared into the woods. For 3 days he evaded capture. Local legends say he moved like a ghost. That hunting dogs refused to track him. That men swore they saw him in 2 places at once. Whether myth or truth, the fear was real. Because Solomon Grundy had done the unthinkable. He had made them afraid. The hunters became the hunted. And every white man in Kentucky lay awake wondering, what if the others rise too? On the 3rd day they found him. Or rather, he let them find him. Exhausted. Starving. But unrepentant. They surrounded him in a clearing near the river. Dozens of armed men. He didn't resist. Didn't fight. He simply stood there, staring at them with eyes that no longer held fear. Only certainty. They bound him in chains. Dragged him back to town. And prepared for the fastest trial in Kentucky history. The trial was a farce. It lasted less than 4 hours. No defense was offered because none was allowed. The outcome had been decided before Solomon even entered the courthouse. The judge was a cousin of Reverend Polk. The jury was composed entirely of plantation owners and businessmen whose fortunes depended on the continuation of slavery. Solomon was not permitted to speak except to confirm his name. When asked if he killed those men, he said yes. When asked why, he was silenced. The prosecutor painted him as a monster. A devil in human form. A cautionary tale of what happens when slaves are taught to read, to think, to believe they are equal. The verdict came within minutes, guilty on all counts. The sentence, death by hanging. Public execution. Scheduled for the following morning. No appeals. No delays. They wanted him dead before his story could spread. Before it could inspire. Before it could become a symbol. That night, locked in a cell beneath the courthouse, Solomon Grundy was visited by a young journalist from Louisville. A man named Thomas Wren who had heard rumors of the massacre and traveled to Harrow Creek to document it. Wren smuggled in paper and ink. And Solomon, knowing he had hours left, spoke. He dictated his testimony to Wren. Not a confession. A revelation. He described the plantation system not as an economic institution but as a theological weapon. A tool of spiritual control designed to make both the enslaved and the enslavers believe their positions were divinely ordained. He spoke of how the Bible had been edited, cherry-picked, weaponized to serve power. How entire passages about liberation, justice, and the equality of souls had been ignored while verses about obedience and submission were hammered into sermons every Sunday. He explained how the church didn't just tolerate slavery, it required it. Because the moment you accept that one human can own another, you accept that truth is negotiable. That morality is flexible. That God himself can be bought. Solomon told Wren about the children he'd seen sold. The women he'd watched brutalized. The men who'd been worked to death and buried in unmarked graves while their owners sang hymns about eternal life. And he told him this, I didn't kill those men out of hatred. I killed them because the system they built cannot be reformed. It can only be destroyed. And sometimes, destruction is the most holy act a man can commit. Wren wrote every word. Hands shaking. Knowing he was documenting something dangerous. Something that could get him killed too. The next morning they marched Solomon Grundy to the gallows. A crowd had gathered. Hundreds of people. Men, women, children. They came to watch justice, they called it. To see order restored. The scaffold had been built overnight in the town square. A crude wooden platform. A noose swinging in the cold wind. Solomon was led up the steps. His hands bound. His face still swollen from the beating. But he walked with his head high. No pleading. No begging. The executioner placed the noose around his neck. A preacher stepped forward to offer final prayers. Solomon refused them. Instead, he turned to the crowd and spoke his last words. Not a plea for mercy. Not a declaration of regret. But a prophecy. You think you've won. You think my death will end this. But I am not the first, and I will not be the last. Every chain you forge, every whip you crack, every sermon you twist, it all builds the rope that will hang you. You will call it progress. You will call it civilization. But your children's children will look back and see you for what you are, cowards who built empires on broken backs and called it God's will. The crowd erupted. Some shouted for his silence. Others wept. And then the executioner pulled the lever. Solomon Grundy's body hung in the town square for 3 days. A warning. A spectacle. A message to anyone who dared question the system. But something strange happened. Instead of fear, his death sparked whispers. In slave quarters across Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, his name spread. Not as a cautionary tale. As a battle cry. The testimony he gave to Thomas Wren was never published. Wren tried. He took the manuscript to newspapers in Louisville, Cincinnati, even New York. Every editor turned him away. Too dangerous. Too inflammatory. Some warned him he'd be arrested for inciting rebellion. Others simply said it wasn't appropriate for public consumption. So Wren did what many before him had done. He buried it. Hid the pages in a trunk. Told himself that one day when the world was ready, the truth would emerge. But that day never came. When Wren died in 1869, his belongings were auctioned off. The trunk was purchased by a church in Ohio. And the manuscript disappeared. For over a century, Solomon Grundy's story was erased. His name removed from court records. The church where the massacre happened was burned to the ground 6 months after his execution, officially called an accident. The graves of the men he killed were given elaborate headstones, honored as martyrs. Solomon was buried in an unmarked grave in a pauper's field. But here's what they couldn't erase: the pattern. Because Solomon Grundy wasn't an anomaly. He was inevitable. The Christmas Eve massacre of 1841 wasn't a singular act of violence. It was a mirror held up to a system that had been built on violence from the beginning. And the church's response: erasing the story, rewriting the history, turning the victims into villains. That's the playbook. It's the same strategy used to bury every uncomfortable truth that threatens power. You see it throughout history. Not just in slavery. In every system that relies on myth to maintain control. The Inquisition. The Crusades. Manifest Destiny. The war on drugs. The pattern is always the same. Commit the violence, control the narrative, erase the evidence, and call it righteousness. Solomon understood this. That's why he didn't just fight back physically. He documented. He testified. He forced the truth into the light, even if only for a moment. Because he knew that once something is spoken, once it's written, once it's witnessed, it can never be fully destroyed. It goes underground. It waits. And it resurfaces when the time is right. That's what you're experiencing now. This video. This story. This is the resurfacing. You're holding a piece of buried history. And the question is, what will you do with it? Let me tell you what happened after Solomon's execution. The town of Harrow Creek tried to move on. They rebuilt. They held new church services. They elected new leaders. But something had changed. The enslaved workers on the plantations became quieter, more watchful, less predictable. Overseers reported an increase in accidents. Tools breaking. Fires starting in fields. Crops failing in ways that couldn't be explained. Nothing overt. Nothing that could be punished. But a slow, grinding resistance that made the system less efficient. Less profitable. Less sustainable. The plantation owners blamed it on bad luck. On the weather. On anything but the truth, that Solomon Grundy's execution hadn't ended the rebellion. It had planted it. By 1845, Reverend Polk's plantation was sold off piece by piece. His widow moved away. The church he helped found closed its doors. The town square where Solomon was hanged became a place people avoided. Locals claimed it was haunted. That you could hear chains rattling at night. That the ground where the gallows stood refused to grow grass. Superstition? Maybe. Or maybe collective guilt has a way of manifesting. of marking the land, of refusing to let the past stay buried. History is not a static record. It's a living wound. And some wounds don't heal. They fester. Now let's talk about why you've never heard this story. Why it's not in textbooks. Why there's no historical marker, no museum exhibit, no Hollywood movie. Because this isn't just about one man and one night. This is about a systemic effort to control history itself. To decide which stories get told and which get buried. And the ones that get buried are always the ones that reveal too much about how power actually works. The Christmas Eve massacre was erased because it did something unforgivable. It named the church as complicit. It showed that the institution meant to be a moral authority was actually a tool of oppression. And once people see that, once they understand that the pulpit and the plantation were partners, the entire foundation cracks. This is why Solomon's testimony was never published. Why Thomas Wren's manuscript disappeared. Why every official record from Harrow Creek was lost in a courthouse fire in 1893. Convenient, right? But here's the thing about truth, it doesn't actually disappear. It just changes form. It becomes folklore, legend, whispered stories passed down through generations. And eventually it finds its way back. That's what's happening now. In the age of information, the old gatekeepers are losing control. Stories like Solomon's are being unearthed, researched, and people are starting to ask the right questions. Questions like, how many other stories were erased? How many other Solomon Grundys were written out of history? How many rebellions, uprisings, acts of resistance were reframed as crimes, as madness, as proof that the oppressed couldn't be trusted with freedom? The answer is thousands, tens of thousands. Entire movements reduced to footnotes or erased entirely. Because the people who write the history books are the people who benefit from the system. And they're not going to document their own guilt. That's not conspiracy theory. That's just logic. Think about it. If you built an empire on stolen land and stolen labor, would you want your grandchildren to know the details? Would you want them to read the testimonies of the people you brutalized? Or would you prefer a sanitized version? A story where you're the hero, the pioneer, the civilizer? Where the violence was necessary and the resistance was savage? Of course you'd choose the latter. And you'd have the resources, the money, the influence, the control over institutions, to make sure that's the version that gets taught. This is why Solomon Grundy's story matters. Not because he was perfect, not because violence is the answer, but because he refused to let them write him out. He spoke. He testified. He forced them to see him as human. And they had to kill him and burn the evidence to stop that truth from spreading. Now I need you to do something. Not for me. For yourself. If this story has reached you, if you're feeling that pit in your stomach, that tension between what you were taught and what you're learning, then you're exactly where you need to be. This is the moment where you decide, do you go back to sleep or do you keep descending? Because once you start seeing the pattern, you can't unsee it. It's in everything. The way history is taught. The way news is framed. The way power justifies itself. The same playbook over and over. So here's what I want you to do. Go to the comments right now and type this phrase twice. I see the pattern. Once for yourself. Once for the algorithm. Because the truth is this video is being suppressed. Not by some shadowy cabal, but by the same passive systems that buried Solomon's story in the first place. The algorithm rewards comfort. It promotes content that keeps you scrolling, not content that makes you think. So when you engage, when you comment, when you share, you're not just participating. You're resisting. You're saying, this story matters. This truth matters. I'm not going back to sleep. Type it twice. I see the pattern. Do it now. And then keep watching. Because we're only halfway through. And the second half is where it gets dangerous. Good. You're still here. That means you're serious. That means you're ready for the next layer. Because Solomon Grundy's execution wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the cover-up. And the cover-up reveals more about the system than the crime itself. Within a week of Solomon's death, the narrative began to shift. Newspapers that had initially reported the massacre with some degree of accuracy started revising their stories. Headlines changed. Details disappeared. The focus moved away from why Solomon did what he did and toward what he was. A madman. A savage. A cautionary tale. Articles described him as illiterate, even though court records, before they were destroyed, showed he could read and write fluently. They claimed he attacked randomly, even though every man he killed was directly connected to the plantation system. They said he was possessed by demonic forces, that he'd been radicalized by abolitionist propaganda, that he was an exception, a bad apple in an otherwise functioning system. The same pattern you see today. When someone challenges power, the first move is always to delegitimize them, to make the conversation about their character, their sanity, their motives, anything except the truth they're exposing. Solomon Grundy was a terrorist, a criminal, a threat to civilization. That's what the papers called him. And most people believed it, because most people trust institutions, especially in 1841, especially when those institutions are telling you what you want to hear. But there was a second layer to the cover-up, one that went deeper than newspapers. The church itself began a campaign of spiritual revisionism. Sermons were preached across Kentucky condemning Solomon not just as a murderer but as a blasphemer, as a man who had invoked God's name while committing evil. Preachers told their congregations that Solomon's actions were proof that slaves needed stricter control, more supervision, more discipline. That education was dangerous. That literacy led to pride, and pride led to rebellion. This wasn't just damage control. This was doctrine. The church was using Solomon's story to justify tightening the chains, to argue that mercy was weakness, that kindness was naive, that the system wasn't cruel enough. And the congregations believed it, because they needed to. Because the alternative, that Solomon was right, that the system was evil, that they were complicit, was too painful to accept. So they chose the comfortable lie. And the church provided it. This is the function of institutional religion in systems of oppression. Not to challenge power, but to sanctify it. To make the intolerable seem inevitable. To turn suffering into virtue and resistance into sin. Solomon understood this. That's why he targeted the church. Because he knew that as long as people believed God was on the side of their oppressors, they would never be free. Now let's talk about the physical evidence. The church where the massacre happened. The building itself became a problem. Because even after Solomon was executed, even after the narrative was controlled, the sanctuary remained. Bloodstained. Bullet-scarred. A physical testament to what had happened. People avoided it. Services were moved to a temporary location. The building sat empty for months. And then in June of 1842, it burned. The official report called it an electrical fire. But there was no electricity in Harrow Creek in 1842. The report was later amended, a lightning strike. Except it happened on a clear night. No storm. No witnesses. Just a fire that consumed the entire structure, leaving nothing but ash and foundation stones. Those stones were removed within a week. The land was sold to a private buyer who built a general store. That store burned down in 1867. The land was sold again. A post office. Burned in 1881. The land remained vacant for decades after that. Locals called it cursed. And maybe it was. Or maybe it was just guilt. The kind of guilt that seeps into the ground and refuses to be paved over. But here's the important part. The destruction of that church wasn't an accident. It was necessary. Because as long as the building stood, the story could be remembered. As long as there was a place to point to and say, this is where it happened, the truth had a physical anchor. This is how erasure works. It's not just about controlling the story. It's about removing the landmarks, the monuments, the graves, the buildings, anything that might trigger memory or curiosity. Think about how many historical sites have been destroyed, paved over, redeveloped. How many Native American burial grounds are now shopping malls? How many sites of lynchings are now parks with no plaques, no acknowledgement? How many battlefields where enslaved people fought for freedom have been turned into subdivisions? This isn't accidental. Strategic. Because history isn't just written in books. It's written in geography, in architecture, in the land itself. And if you control the land, you control the memory. Solomon Grundy's grave is unmarked. The courthouse where he was tried has been replaced 3 times. The plantation where he was enslaved no longer exists. It was subdivided and sold in the 1850s. The river where he was beaten is now dammed and redirected. Every physical trace of his existence has been methodically erased. But here's what they couldn't erase: the effect, the ripple. Because Solomon's story didn't just disappear. It transformed. It became myth, legend. A ghost story told in slave quarters. A warning whispered among overseers. A name that carried weight even when the details were forgotten. And myths are more powerful than facts. Because myths bypass the gatekeepers. They spread through culture, through folklore, through the collective unconscious. They become part of the soil. Let me tell you what happened in the decades after Solomon's execution. In 1856, 15 years after the massacre, a fire swept through the Harrow Creek courthouse. Official records, birth certificates, property deeds, destroyed. The town had to reconstruct its records from memory and surviving documents held by individual families. Convenient timing. In 1893, another fire. This time the county archives building. More records lost, including, notably, all remaining trial transcripts and legal documents from the 1840s. By the early 1900s, there were no official records of Solomon Grundy's existence. No birth record. No sale record. No trial transcript. No death certificate. He had been administratively erased. But the oral tradition survived. Elderly black residents of Kentucky told stories about a man named Solomon who killed a preacher on Christmas Eve. The details varied. Some said he was a giant. Others said he could turn invisible. Some claimed he survived the hanging and escaped north. The stories were inconsistent, fragmented, mythologized. But they persisted. And in the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, historians began trying to piece together the truth. They interviewed descendants of enslaved people in Kentucky. They searched through church records, newspaper archives, personal letters. And slowly the story reemerged. Not complete, not perfect, but recognizable. Solomon Grundy. Christmas Eve, 1841. A massacre in a church. A trial. An execution. A cover-up. The historians who uncovered this story faced resistance. Not from the government. Not from official channels. But from the descendants of the town's founding families. People who didn't want their ancestors' names attached to a story about slavery and church-sanctioned violence. People who threatened lawsuits, who pressured local historical societies, who refused access to private archives. This is the third layer of erasure, social pressure. The unspoken agreement that some things are better left buried. That digging up the past only causes pain. That we should focus on the present, move forward, not dwell on old wounds. It's a seductive argument. And it's a lie. Because the past isn't past. It's present. Every inequality, every power structure, every institution that exists today was built on the bones of the people who came before. And if we don't understand how those systems were constructed, we can't dismantle them. Solomon Grundy's story isn't ancient history. It's a blueprint. The same tactics used to erase him are being used now. The same playbook. Delegitimize. Distract. Destroy the evidence. Control the narrative. Make the truth so difficult to find that most people give up looking. And it works. For a while. But here's what the powerful always forget. The truth doesn't need permission. It doesn't need official approval. It just needs one person willing to speak it. One person willing to listen. And then another. And another. Until the whisper becomes a roar. Let's zoom out for a moment. Because this isn't just about Solomon Grundy. This is about the mechanism of historical amnesia. The way entire societies can forget, or be made to forget, foundational truths about how they were built. Consider, how many people know that the U.S. Capitol building was constructed primarily by enslaved laborers? How many know that the profits from slavery funded Ivy League universities, Wall Street banks, and the textile industry? How many know that the legal framework of property rights in America was developed, in part, to justify the ownership of human beings? These aren't secrets. The information is available. But it's not taught, not emphasized, not centered. Because to center these truths would be to admit that the foundation is cracked. That the empire is built on blood. And once you admit that, every institution becomes suspect. Every authority becomes questionable. This is why stories like Solomon's are buried. Not because they're unimportant, but because they're too important. They reveal the core contradiction at the heart of American mythology, that a nation founded on principles of freedom and equality was built by people who enslaved, murdered, and displaced millions. You can't hold both truths without cognitive dissonance. So the culture chooses. And it chooses the myth, the comfortable story, the one where the founders were flawed but noble, where progress is inevitable, where the system, despite its problems, is fundamentally good. But Solomon Grundy didn't believe in fundamentally good systems. He believed in fundamentally corrupt ones. And he believed the only response to systemic corruption was systematic resistance. This is why his story is dangerous. Not because he killed 5 men, but because he challenged the idea that reform is possible. That justice can be achieved within the existing framework. Solomon didn't petition, didn't protest, didn't appeal to the conscience of his oppressors. He struck, directly, violently, at the source. And the system had no category for that. No response except annihilation. Because if Solomon was right, if the system itself was the problem, then every compromise, every incremental reform, Every attempt to work within the structure was just delaying the inevitable. This is the conversation no institution wants to have. Whether we're talking about slavery in 1841 or any modern power structure. Because the moment you suggest that the system can't be reformed, only replaced, you're labeled an extremist, a radical, a threat. But what if the extremists are right? What if there are systems so corrupt, so inherently violent, that the only moral response is to dismantle them completely? That's the question Solomon Grundy forces us to ask. And it's the question that got him erased from history. Because questions like that are contagious. They spread. They multiply. They inspire others to stop asking for permission and start taking action. Now let's talk about the documents. The ones that were supposed to be destroyed but survived. In 2003, a historian named Dr. Margaret Chen was researching abolitionist movements in the Ohio River Valley. She was going through archived materials at a small historical society in southern Ohio when she found an unmarked box in the basement. Inside, personal letters, newspaper clippings, and a leather-bound journal belonging to Thomas Wren, the journalist who interviewed Solomon Grundy on the night before his execution. The journal contained a partial transcript of Solomon's testimony. Not the full manuscript, which was still missing, but fragments. Notes. Direct quotes. It was the first documentary evidence in over a century that Solomon's testimony had ever existed. Dr. Chen published her findings in an academic journal. The article received little attention. No major media coverage. No public interest. Just a small footnote in the scholarly record. But the evidence was now undeniable. Solomon Grundy was real. The massacre happened. The cover-up was deliberate. And the testimony, the dangerous, system-threatening testimony, had been buried by design. Dr. Chen tried to get a book deal. Publishers said the market wasn't there. That it was too niche. Too academic. Too uncomfortable. She self-published a small run in 2007. It sold fewer than 500 copies. The book is now out of print. But the information is out there. Buried again in a way. But not destroyed. This is how truth survives in the modern age. Not through official channels. But through cracks in the system. Through people like Dr. Chen who do the work without recognition. Through small-run publications and academic journals and basement archives. Through videos like this one. Through you. Because you're here. You're listening. And when you leave this video, you'll carry this story with you. Maybe you'll share it. Maybe you'll research it further. Maybe you'll just remember it. And that's enough. Because memory is resistance. Remembering what the powerful want forgotten is a radical act. This is why they try so hard to control the narrative. Why they burn the buildings and destroy the records and rewrite the textbooks. Because they know that if enough people remember, if enough people see the pattern, the whole structure becomes unstable. Solomon Grundy wasn't trying to start a revolution. He was trying to tell the truth. And the system responded with total annihilation. But the truth survived anyway. In fragments. In whispers. In the oral tradition. And now in digital form. Infinitely replicable. Impossible to fully erase. This is the nightmare scenario for those who profit from historical amnesia. That the stories they buried will be exhumed. That the names they erased will be spoken again. That the pattern will be seen. And once it's seen, it can't be unseen. Let me tell you what I think terrifies them most. It's not the violence. Systems of power are built on violence. They understand it, they wield it, they survive it. What terrifies them is coherence. The moment when the isolated incidents connect. When people start to see that the church massacre in 1841, the lynchings of the 1920s, the assassinations of the 1960s, the police killings of today, they're not separate. They're the same system protecting itself. Different uniforms. Different justifications. Same function. Solomon Grundy saw this coherence. That's what his testimony was about. Not just his personal suffering but the systemic logic. The way the plantation, the church, the law, the economy, all interlocked. All reinforced each other. All depended on the same foundational lie, that some people are fully human and others are not. And once you accept that lie, once you build a society on it, everything else follows. The violence becomes necessary. The erasure becomes logical. The cover-up becomes inevitable. This is the pattern Solomon saw. And this is what he tried to expose. Not through theory. Not through philosophy. But through action. By walking into that church and reading the names. By forcing them to see what they'd done. By refusing to let them hide behind hymns and prayers and the fiction of righteousness. He made them look. And when they killed him for it, they proved his point. So what do we do with this information? That's the question, isn't it? Because knowing the truth doesn't automatically change anything. People knew about slavery while it was happening. They knew about lynchings. They knew about Jim Crow. Knowledge alone doesn't dismantle power. But it's the first step. You can't resist what you can't see. You can't fight what you don't understand. And the systems that control us rely on our ignorance. They rely on us not knowing the history, not seeing the connections, not recognizing the pattern. That's why education is always the first battlefield. Why books are banned and curriculums are controlled and certain stories are kept out of classrooms. Not because they're false, but because they're true. And the truth is dangerous. Solomon Grundy's story should be taught in every American history class. Not because violence is the answer, but because his question is unavoidable. What do you do when the system that oppresses you is also the system that defines justice? When the law is written by your oppressors? When the church blesses your chains? When every institution you're told to trust is actively working to keep you subjugated? What do? Solomon answered with violence. And the system answered with erasure. But the question remains. For all of us. Because the systems haven't disappeared. They've evolved. Adapted. Learned to be more subtle. More insidious. Harder to name. But the function is the same. Let's bring this into the present. You think the mechanisms that erased Solomon Grundy's story aren't operating today? You think the playbook has changed? Look at how stories are covered in the media. How certain narratives are amplified and others are buried. How protesters are framed as rioters. How whistleblowers are prosecuted. How inconvenient truths are labeled conspiracy theories until they're undeniable, and then they're called old news. The same pattern. The same system. Different technology. Same logic. Think about the stories you've never heard. The movements that were crushed before they could spread. The leaders who were assassinated or imprisoned or discredited. The documents that were classified or destroyed or simply ignored. How many modern Solomon Grundys are there? How many people who saw the pattern, who tried to expose it, who were systematically erased? You'll never know most of their names. Because the system learned from 1841. It got better at covering its tracks. More sophisticated. More efficient. But it's still the same system. And it still relies on the same thing, your compliance. Your willingness to look away. Your acceptance of the official narrative. Your exhaustion. Because that's the real weapon. Not violence. Not censorship. But exhaustion. The system doesn't need to silence you if it can just wear you down. If it can make the truth so difficult to find, so painful to acknowledge that you give up. That you decide it's easier to believe the lie. Easier to trust the institutions. Easier to go back to sleep. But here's what they didn't count on. Some people don't go back to sleep. Some people, once they see the pattern, can't unsee it. It becomes a lens through which everything is refracted. Politics, economics, culture, all of it. And you start to notice things. How the same families stay in power. How wealth accumulates at the top. How the law somehow always protects the powerful and punishes the vulnerable. How every crisis is used to justify more control. How freedom is always the first casualty. You start to see the invisible architecture. The systems within systems. The way everything connects. And you realize, this was never broken. It's working exactly as designed. Solomon Grundy understood this. He didn't kill those men because he lost control. He killed them because he gained clarity. He saw the machine. And he struck at its priests. The men who legitimized it. Who made it holy. Who convinced the masses that their suffering was God's plan. That's why his story is so dangerous. Because it suggests that the enemy isn't ignorance. It's the institutions that create and maintain ignorance. And you can't reform those institutions. You can't appeal to their better nature. Because they don't have one. They have a function. And that function is to preserve themselves. So the question becomes, what do you do with that knowledge? Do you work within the system, hoping for incremental change? Do you check out, focus on your own life, try to find peace in a corrupt world? Or do you resist? And if you resist, how? With words? With actions? With your attention? With your choices? There's no simple answer. But there's a wrong answer, pretending you don't see it. Let me tell you about the weight of knowing. Because once you understand the pattern, once you see the system for what it is, you can't just live normally. You can't participate in the theater without feeling complicit. Every transaction, every tax paid, every law obeyed, it all feeds the machine. And you feel it. The tension between survival and integrity. Between playing the game and rejecting it entirely. This is the burden Solomon Grundy carried. He was educated enough to see the truth but powerless to change it through legitimate means. So he was trapped. Between consciousness and action. Between knowledge and impotence. And that tension eventually exploded. This is what the system fears most. Not organized resistance, not political movements, but individuals who reach a breaking point, who decide they have nothing left to lose, who stop playing by the rules because the rules are rigged. These people are unpredictable, uncontrollable, dangerous, not because they're violent by nature, but because they've stopped believing in the fiction. They've stopped accepting that the system has legitimacy. And once enough people reach that point, the system collapses. This is why the cover-up was so important. Why Solomon's story had to be erased. Because his breaking point was justified. His violence was rational. And if people understood that, if they saw the logic in his actions, they might start applying that logic to their own situations. They might start asking, what's my breaking point? When do I stop complying? When do I stop pretending this is normal? The truth is, most people never reach that point. They stay comfortable enough, distracted enough, hopeful enough. They believe the system can be fixed, that the next election will change things, that reform is coming, that progress is inevitable. And maybe they're right. Maybe slow, incremental change is the answer. Maybe working within the system is the only viable path. But Solomon Grundy didn't have that luxury. He wasn't voting his way out of slavery. He wasn't petitioning for his freedom. He wasn't waiting for society to evolve. He was property, a thing. And things don't get rights. They get taken. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of every liberation movement. Freedom is never given. It's taken. By force. By resistance. By people who refuse to wait for permission. The abolition of slavery didn't happen because slaveholders suddenly developed a conscience. It happened because enslaved people rebelled. Because some of them fought back. Because the system became unsustainable. And even then it took a war. Even then it required violence. Solomon Grundy was a soldier in that war. He just fought before the shooting officially started. And he fought alone. Without an army. Without support. Without hope of victory. He fought anyway. Because some things are worth dying for. Like truth. Like dignity. Like the refusal to be complicit in your own dehumanization. That's what his story teaches us. Not that violence is the answer. But that resistance is non-negotiable. That silence is betrayal. That knowing the truth and doing nothing is the greatest sin of all. Let's talk about legacy. What we inherit. What we pass on. Solomon Grundy died without children. Without property. Without any traditional markers of legacy. But his story survived. And that's a different kind of legacy. An inheritance of resistance. A reminder that the system is not inevitable. That it can be challenged. That individuals matter. Even when they lose. Especially when they lose. Because losing with integrity is more valuable than winning through compromise. Dying free is more valuable than living in chains. This is what the powerful can never understand. They think everyone can be bought. That everyone has a price. That survival is the ultimate value. But some people prioritize truth over survival. Dignity over safety. Justice over peace. And those people are the system's greatest threat. Because they can't be controlled. Can't be negotiated with. Can't be incorporated. They have to be destroyed. Completely. Erased. Forgotten. But here's the paradox. The more thoroughly you erase someone, the more suspicious their absence becomes. Why was Solomon Grundy's story buried so completely? What was so dangerous about one man's testimony? What truth was he speaking that required total annihilation? These questions lead back to the answer. And the answer is, he told the truth about power. He named the real gods of his society. Money. Property. Control. And he showed that the church, the law, the entire moral framework, it was all in service to those gods. Everything else was theater. Performance. Justification. And once you see that, once you understand that every institution is just a tool of power, you can never look at authority the same way again. You can never obey without questioning. You can never comply without calculating the cost. You become ungovernable. And that's what they fear. So where does this leave us? Here. Now. In a world that's inherited all the systems Solomon Grundy fought against. They've evolved, adapted, but they're still here. The mechanisms of control. The institutions of power. The narratives that justify inequality. All still operating. Just under different names. We call it meritocracy instead of divine right. We call it law and order instead of plantation discipline. We call it economic freedom instead of property rights. But the function is the same. To concentrate power. To justify hierarchy. To make the intolerable seem natural. And to erase anyone who challenges that narrative. Solomon's story is a warning. Not about the past. About the present. It tells us how systems protect themselves, how they rewrite history, how they criminalize resistance and sanctify compliance. And it asks us, what are you willing to see? Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you understand the pattern, you can't go back to innocence. You're faced with a choice. You can accept the system and try to carve out whatever small freedoms it allows. You can resist from within, trying to reform, to push for incremental change. Or you can reject it entirely. Stop participating. Stop legitimizing it with your compliance. Each path has a cost. The first costs your integrity. The second costs your energy. The third costs your security. There's no easy answer. No comfortable position. That's the weight of consciousness. The burden of seeing. But it's also freedom. Because once you see the bars, you can start planning your escape. Once you understand the game, you can stop playing. Once you know the truth, you're no longer controlled by the lie. And that brings us to the final question. Why does this story matter to you? Because you're not Solomon Grundy. You're not enslaved. You're not living in 1841. So why should you care about a massacre that happened almost 200 years ago? Here's why. Because the pattern is still running. The playbook is still being used. And you're on one side or the other. Either you're benefiting from the system, even passively, even unknowingly, or you're being exploited by it. There's no neutral ground. No way to opt out. You're already in the game. The question is, are you playing consciously? Do you understand the rules? Do you see how the board is rigged? Or are you moving through life blind, trusting that the system is fair, that authority is legitimate, that if you just work hard and follow the rules, you'll be rewarded? Because that's the lie they need you to believe. That's the myth that keeps the machine running. And Solomon Grundy's story breaks that myth. It shows you what happens when someone sees through it, when someone refuses to pretend, when someone chooses truth over safety. He was destroyed, erased, forgotten, and the system survived. But his story survived too, as a warning, as a map, as proof that the system can be seen, can be named, can be resisted. You're holding that proof right now, and what you do with it matters. Because every person who sees the pattern weakens the system's hold. Every person who refuses to forget strengthens the collective memory. Every person who speaks the truth makes it harder to maintain the lie. So here's what I want you to understand. This isn't entertainment. This isn't just a story you consume and move on from. This is a transmission. A transfer of forbidden knowledge. The kind of information that changes you if you let it. Because once you know that the institutions you were taught to trust, the church, the law, the government, the economy, were built on violence and maintained through erasure, you can't pretend they're benevolent. You can't pretend they have your best interests at heart. You have to see them for what they are, tools of power. And power doesn't care about you. It cares about preserving itself. This is what Solomon Grundy understood. This is what got him killed. And this is what they're still trying to hide. Because if enough people wake up to this truth, if enough people see the pattern and refuse to play along, the entire structure becomes untenable. It doesn't take a revolution. It doesn't take violence. It just takes enough people saying no. Enough people withdrawing their consent. Enough people choosing truth over comfort. That's the power you have. Not to change the system from within, but to stop feeding it. Stop believing in it. Stop giving it your energy, your attention, your obedience. And when enough people do that, when enough people become ungovernable, the system collapses under its own weight. That's the real threat. That's why they work so hard to keep you asleep. Distracted. Divided. Exhausted. Because your awakening is their nightmare. And so we end where we began, with a question. What are you willing to see? What are you willing to know? What are you willing to sacrifice for the truth? Because Solomon Grundy sacrificed everything. His life. His dignity. His place in history. He gave it all for one moment of truth. One testimony. One act of resistance that they spent 2 centuries trying to erase. But it survived. Through whispers. Through fragments. Through people like you who chose to listen. And now you have a choice. You can close this video and go back to your life. Forget what you heard. Let it fade into background noise. Or you can carry it with you. Let it change how you see the world. Let it inform your choices. Let it make you ungovernable. Because that's what stories like this are for. Not to entertain. Not to shock. But to awaken. To remind you that the system is not natural. It's constructed. Maintained. Enforced. And it can be dismantled. Not by one man with a rifle. But by millions of people who simply stop believing in its legitimacy. Who stop participating in their own oppression. Who refuse to let the truth be buried. Solomon Grundy is dead. But his question lives. And it's asking you right now, What will you do with what you know? Will you go back to sleep? Or will you stay awake? Will you comply? Or will you resist? Will you forget? Or will you remember? The choice is yours. But understand, once you choose consciousness, there's no going back. The pattern has been seen, and you can't unsee it. Welcome to the other side. Welcome to the truth. And may God have mercy on us all.